so that should be working. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another week of our pasture prep series. And today we're going to be talking about examining lameness on grazing dairies. And before we move forward, probably some of you have noticed that we turned on the subtitles or the closed captioning. They're likely popping up at the bottom of your screen or your phone if you're joining from there, like on the app. You can turn those off if you find them distracting. So if you go to your Zoom window and look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little CC symbol. If you click on that, it will allow you to turn those off so that you're not viewing them, but they're still being recorded. So then when we put this on the internet, folks that want them can have them. And if you have any problems with that, feel free to dump your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to those. But this week is our fourth week. We do only have 2 more weeks after this one of this series. And your presenters for today are myself, Alicia Duranke, Betsy Hicks with the South Central New York Dairy and Field Crops Program. And then we have our guest of honor, Lindsay Ferlito, who is a dairy management specialist on the North Country Regional Ag Team. So we're gonna jump right into today. And some of the key things that we're going to talk about and cover are scoring lameness and how you evaluate it, prevention and treatment for lameness in your herd. We're going to talk about some grazing specific considerations as well as benefits for grazing herds. And then we're also going to go through a case study. So let's go ahead and kick off with a poll question. And we want to know, how often do you evaluate lameness in your herd, regardless of species? So give me 1 second to pull this up. Lameness 1, launch. Okay, so do you evaluate lameness in your herd once a week, once a month, once per season, so every 3 to 4 months, maybe 1 to 2 times per year? If the trimmer's just out, you happen to do some checking pretty irregularly, or you never check for lameness.
Got some answers rolling in. Just looking through the participant list to make sure we've got 6 voted.
Give 1 more second. All right, we'll go ahead and end, and I'll share those results so you can see. But it looks like a majority of people are saying that they evaluate lameness once a week, which that's good. 1 person said once a month, and then 1 person did say never. So
yeah, so we're going to be going through some examples. And if you never do because you're not sure how, then you're in luck, because we're going to talk through some of this right now. So
yes. If I could get it to move forward. So we did want to talk about some prevalence statistics to start off, just so that everybody kind of has a picture of what lameness in the United States look like. And these statistics are specific to dairy herds. So this data is coming from the NAMS 2014 survey, which I'm sure you guys probably hear about a lot. But the national average reported in that was 16.8% of the herd experiencing lameness. And that was the second most prominent issue that producers identified in their herds, behind mastitis. And farms, based on their size of small, medium, or large, did report different rates of lameness on their farms. So small farms said that they had 84.7% of their cows have at least 1 instance of lameness throughout the year. And then large farms said, they had at least 1 case of lameness, not all of their cows. and 100% of large farms said that they at least had one case of lameness in their herd. So a pretty common issue. Almost every single herd is going to have a minimum of one case per year, but obviously, seeing as the national average is 16.8% of cows, that likely you're going to see more than one case throughout the year. And not surprisingly, the average number of cases that a farm reported identifying increased with farm size. And that's likely just a result of having more cows, right? Because those percentages weren't drastically different. It was 13% compared to 18%. So I think just more cows, right? And then farms reported that 7.2% of their cows were culled due to lameness. So this is obviously a big problem in terms of just day-to-day management, but then also influences culling decisions pretty heavily. And something to note is that these estimates and herd average data is actually likely pretty low because a research study out of Canada found that trained researchers identified lameness 2.5 times more than herd producers did. So producers identified lameness in their herd around 9%, and researchers identified it in that same herd at 22%. So that just shows you that there's likely some differences in terms of what producers are looking at versus researchers are looking at, and maybe some differences in sensitivity to what we're looking at. And so along those same lines, remember that each farm will obviously experience variable levels throughout the year, or potentially have a random event pop up where you see a lot of lameness. So it's really important to make sure that you are checking lameness, which sounds like a lot of you are and is great. And hopefully you're also tracking your lameness. Making sure that you're tracking and recording lameness events can help you identify any sort of seasonal spikes or management changes that influence your lameness rate, and can make sure that you are preventing those when possible, and then addressing and treating them as quickly as possible when they do come up. So when we're thinking about scoring lameness, we want to keep in mind that lameness is a scale. It's not necessarily that a cow is perfectly sound or she's not, that she's lame. We often see a lot of minute changes that occur in a cow's gait that can indicate if she's sound, if she's a little bit lame, often referred to as like mildly lame, moderately lame, or severely lame. And a lot of these scales are either a 3-point scale or a 5-point scale. If you've worked on those scales yourself, or maybe with your veterinarian, etc., that's probably what you're familiar with. And when you're scoring lameness, you want to make sure that a trained person is doing that scoring. Obviously, the more often that you can score, the better, because you're going to hopefully catch lameness in the more mild cases and address it, rather than having cows get severely lame and then needing to do more aggressive treatment. For dairy cows specifically, it's ideal to score cows when they're leaving the milking parlor to make sure that their gait's not potentially influenced by how full their udder is. And then the number of cows that you score on your herd can vary a little bit. So in a perfect world, yes, you would score every single cow whenever you are going through and doing lameness checks. But in some cases, that's not necessarily practical, especially if you have a larger herd. So there are some training resources, which we've linked to at the end, that can help you figure out and calculate how many cows you should be measuring lameness to get a representative sample of what your herd average is.
Alicia, Are we going to talk at all? Sorry, and I apologize because this is my first week. Is there anybody on that has tie stalls?
Good question. I don't know. We didn't ask that. So if you have a tie stall, go ahead and pop it into the chat to us and we can talk some more about that. Do we want to do another poll question, Alicia?
Do we want to do it now or in a second?
And whatever you think, just don't want to lose them.
Well, I guess we'll just, while we wait, if anyone does have tie stalls, there is a separate scoring system for tie stall cows where you can score the cows in the stall. So if you had a situation, which you probably don't if you are letting your cows out to graze, but if you had a situation where your cows were inside, so maybe in the Northeast winter, you're not letting them out that often, you can still score your cows in the stall. It's not as accurate at picking up those mildly lame cases that Alicia was talking about, but it is still a good way to just keep tabs on things. And then if you are in a tie stall situation and you're letting your cows out to pasture, you know, a good time to watch them walk once they're comfortable with the routine of going out to pasture is once you've milked them and you're letting them out, you can just watch them as they exit the barn, because it's better to watch them when they're walking, but you still can score them in the stalls if necessary.
Thanks for that, Lindsay. That's a great point. Yeah, let's go ahead and do our second poll question. So I'm going to launch the poll. And since so many of you said that you do measure lameness in your herd, which is great, we want to know what percent of your herd is lame. So less than 10%, 11 to 20%, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, 41 to 50, or more than 50% of your herd.
And it's completely anonymous. We won't know what you voted, just in case you have any concerns about that. We won't know. 4 of 7 in there. Couple more seconds.
Okay. I will go ahead and share our results. So it looks like almost everybody said that their herd has 10% or less of lameness, and then 11 to 20% was one person as well. So I'll be curious to see, or as we go through the next couple of slides, think in your head about what type of lameness were you actually thinking about? Because as we just kind of started to discuss that it's a scale, right? So, and we didn't classify in this question, severe lameness, moderately lame, mildly lame, anything like that. So, think to yourself, were you lumping all cases together? Were you thinking only of severely lame cows? And maybe how does that influence how you approach lameness and management on your farm? Okay, so just to make sure that we are all on the same page, we will go through a couple of videos looking at gait scoring. So this cow is what would be considered sound, or a score 1. She's walking pretty normally with no obvious asymmetry or weight transferring awkwardly between her limbs. You can't discern which leg is lame in her gait. And, it's okay if she maybe has a few steps that are slightly uneven, but on the whole, she seems to be walking without really any sort of unease.
And the other thing I want to toss into this, her head carriage is very normal. She's not using her head to move her body forward, just carrying her head normally, and limbs don't appear very tight or stiff. She's normal walking. We all love to see this type of cow, right? This is a moving, working cow. This is great.
So then the next one is moderately lame, or if we're doing a 3-point scale, she would be considered a score 2. So you can see some obvious asymmetry in her gait, where her strides are kind of shortening up, and it's affecting the cadence or how smoothly she's walking. She has a little bit of a head bob going on, right? And a little bit more arch to her back. And you can see that her joints are a little bit stiff. So hopefully everybody can kind of see the difference between the first video and this one. Betsy, anything to add?
Yeah, not really, other than, you know, in this cow, like, to me, this cow's lame. And but you still can't, like, you can't really pick up on exactly which foot might be hurting. To me, this cow is lame because she's really stiff. She's got some swollen joints, and this cow needs to be assessed on a table right away.
Yes. So then finally, severely lame cows, or on a 3-point scale, this would be considered a score 3. You know, she's only able to walk with extreme difficulty. She pretty much is almost not bearing any weight on her affected limb. She likely can't keep up with the rest of the herd. And she has a pronounced back arch, and it's really extreme head bob as she's walking along. So if you didn't catch this cow when she was at the score 2, then you definitely need to make sure that you're addressing this cow now and getting her treatment right away. And these are obviously the most easily identifiable cases on the farm, right? Because they're just so extreme. So as you're going through and evaluating lameness in your herd, keep in mind, are you only catching the cows that are at this most severe point? Or are you identifying some of the earlier changes where maybe they're just like walking with a little bit of difficulty, but maybe you can catch that and address that sooner, so then you don't get to this point where it's going to cost you a lot more time, money, and also just affect the cow's welfare as well. So a couple other of considerations to make sure that you are getting accurate evaluations of lameness. As we mentioned, try to look at cows when they're exiting the parlor or the barn when possible, or some other representative time if you're in a tie stall. Take into consideration the location of yourself when you are observing the cows. So make sure that you're positioning yourself in a place that's not going to disrupt the cow's behavior. They're not going to stop and balk at you, or be distracted by you or anything like that. You want to make sure that you're getting an accurate picture of what the gait looks like. And then, of course, consistency is always a good idea, whether it's consistency of the observer, consistency of the time that you're doing it. It will just give you better data to look at over time. So when we're thinking about kind of what are our target goals within our herd, the goals that you should be aiming for, obviously if you're doing better than this, awesome, good job. But we want to have 15% of the herd or less at a moderately lame score. And then for severely lame, for farm 4.0, you want to have 5% or less of your herd severely lame. And then gold standard is definitely to have 1% or less. So when we're thinking about lameness, obviously causes are a big thing that comes to mind. And lameness can be caused by quite a few different factors, such as warts, abscesses, white line disease, injury, or in cows that go outside, rocks can be a big problem. So we have another poll question that we want to know. What causes of lameness do you experience on your farm? And you can select more than one answer here. So do you have warts, white line disease, abscesses, ulcers, injuries, rocks in the hooves, or something else that we didn't list here?
And, we're just exiting the winter season now, hopefully soon. And so think about too, and put it in the chat if you like, if you're experiencing different types of lameness or different causes in different times of season. Some of the studies we talked about that we'll talk about in a little bit, when we're letting cows out on pasture, we might see something very, very different than what we see in the winter time because we have to manage animals differently. So if that's you and you say, oh, I definitely struggle with this in the summer, but it's not a problem in the winter, put it in the chat. We'd love to know.
Okay, we've got most of our folks in, so I'm going to share those. So it looks like pretty variable responses. One person has warts. Many people have abscesses on their farm, a little bit of ulcers and injuries. Rocks in the hooves was another popular one. And then somebody submitted the other. So would love to know what that is. And maybe you are grazing something that's not cows, and that's what's influencing lameness. Because I guess maybe we didn't reiterate enough, but all species that are grazing can have lameness issues, right? So while we're focusing on dairy cows, obviously this is important for any grazing herd. Let me get that out of the way. So there are some data to suggest that the score of, or the locomotion score that you get when you're evaluating lameness in your herd can be an indicator of what type of cause you're dealing with. So this is a slide from some folks at Diamond V that you can see along the bottom. They have the locomotion score, and then along the side axis is the percent of cows with a lesion. So as we increase in locomotion scores, so cows that are more lame are going to be at this score 5. We see the number of cows that have a lesion increase. So the data from this specific farm showed that, or from this specific study showed that 100% of cows that had a score 5 had a lesion in their hoof. Anything to add to that, Betsy?
Yeah, I would, people with the score 2, so a score 2 is still considered sound, but it's interesting to note that still 20% of our cows at a score 2 had some sort of lesion. So the better you get at picking up on when your cows are starting to exhibit signs, the more likely you're going to be able to find something before it gets worse. Definitely, over half of our cows at score 3 have a lesion. So we need to make sure we're picking up on those 3s before they go to a 4 where they're like absolutely limping on a limb. And the milk loss, which we'll get to in a second, the milk loss goes up drastically as we get a higher or a worse locomotion score. So that's all I wanted.
On the flip side of that too, Betsy, though, so looking at the ones that are scored a 3, only about half of them did have a lesion. So also just keep that in mind too, that she still could be lame and showing signs of lameness and having the negative effects of lameness without that classic lesion on a hoof. Maybe it just hasn't developed yet. Maybe she has another reason. So just keep that in mind too. If the trimmer says, oh, I didn't see a lesion, that doesn't mean she's not lame.
Yeah, very, very fair, Lindsay. Thanks.
Which is probably frustrating for producers, but
yeah.
So not surprisingly, lameness is also extremely costly for farms. And a single case of lameness can cost a farm anywhere between $90 to $500 per case. And obviously, it's a concern for the cow, and it's a concern for the producers and the caretakers that are having to deal with that and treat that. So it's really important to make sure that we are focusing on preventing lameness when possible, and then also as soon as we can address it, as soon as we identify a problem, we really work on getting it resolved. So to just really drive this point home, I want to walk through 2 different examples of potential costs. So Let's say that this farm has good management of lameness, and they are a 100 cow farm. So they have pretty good management. So they're hitting our target averages that we described of 15% of their cows are moderately lame, which in a 100 cow herd, 15 cows, right? Make our math super simple. And they're also hitting that 5% severely lame. So 5 cows in their herd had severely lame, severe cases of lameness. And we're going to go ahead and just make some assumptions about the cost of treatment, or the cost that we see of these cases. So $100 for a moderate case and $300 for a severely lame case. So when we calculate that, the moderately lame or moderate lameness cost the farm $1,500, and the severely lame cows cost the farm $1,500 as well. So totaling $3,000. That's a pretty nice chunk of change. I'm sure most of you can think of something much better to spend $3,000 on, right? So then if we look at this same example, but on a farm that has a little bit poorer management, again, still a 100 cow farm, but they have 30% moderate lameness and then 10% severe lameness. We left the cost of each case the same, but the total cost of lameness in this herd with poorer management is going to be double. So it's going to be $6,000. So again, just can cost a lot for the farm and is really ideal to catch it earlier. And of course, prevention is the gold standard.
You know, people talk about this number isn't a real number, but it is. It's a very real number. And, you know, the cost to put in foot baths or some extra preventative care, you can do a lot with just that $3,000 difference. So we're going to talk about some preventative care in just a little bit, but like $3,000, a small farm can do a lot with $3,000.
So when we're talking about that cost, where are these economic losses coming from with lameness? And there's quite a few different things. So cows that have issues with lameness are going to decrease their dry matter intake. So that's going to affect milk production. There also is going to be the costs associated with treatment. You're likely going to experience some issues with reproduction and a whole slew of other downside effects, right, that go along with decreased standing and trouble getting around and decreased dry matter intake. Betsy, Lindsay, anything to add to that at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's just gives like it when you give an economic loss of $100 or $50 to $500 a case, whatever it is. It seems like we're basically just throwing a net out there and saying it can cost you anything. But ultimately, it's because it depends on how lame she is, whether she's mildly lame or severely lame, and then all these other things. And obviously, these other things are going to then be impacted by the other management and housing factors you have on your farm. If you already have a super overcrowded condition and then she's lame, then you're probably going to see more of these negative effects like reduced dry matter intake, reduced production, reduced repro. So that's why there's such a huge range, because it really just kind of depends on how all these other factors are playing with the other management and housing factors on your farm.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Lindsay. So let's look at some data again, just so you know that we're not making it up, like Lindsay said. So this is, again, some data from folks with Diamond V. And I know it's kind of a lot to look at, so I'll try to walk you through it the best that we can. So along this top row here, you can see the locomotion score. And remember that this score 1 is more normal and the score 5 is more inhibited. This total scored is the number of cows that they score for lameness. And then you can see here that there's a column for average daily milk loss, and it's in terms of pounds per cow. So they looked at locomotion in a couple different pens within a herd. So this is just the different pens, and you can see that they each had about 300 cows in that pen. And what you can see is in this pen 2, they had a few more instances of this score 3 and score 4 compared to this bottom one down here, where the bottom pen had a lot more scores 1 and 2, which ended up being that they had a little bit less milk production decreasing. So these top two had more scores 4 and 3, so more inhibited walking and more lameness, which ultimately meant that they were losing 1.1 and 1.2 pounds of milk per cow. So really just driving home that the more lameness that you have, even within a given pen, is going to affect your overall production. So when you're troubleshooting lameness within your herd, you want to make sure that you are utilizing your records and your record keeping. You know, I know it's probably been hammered home a lot, but you don't know what to change if you don't have anything to base it off of. You can also utilize your records to identify if there's any specific problem pens or groups of animals, or even time of year or specific management strategy changes that occur that are either exacerbating your lameness issues, like Lindsay was saying, or are, potentially causing them. And so you want to make sure that you're keeping track of this, so you have better data to go off of, and you can utilize any sort of written records that you have, enter those into the computer so that you can analyze your data and identify if a management intervention needs to be made. And then if a cow comes up with a lameness event, so for example, she has a claw lesion diagnosis, you can then repeat this process and look at your records and identify, has this specific cow had this problem before? Am I seeing a trend with the pen that she's in? Am I seeing a trend with all of my herd? And really better utilize the data that you have available. And something that I know has been said by many people, but you can't manage what you don't track. So if you aren't tracking your lameness, then you are kind of shooting in the dark most often in terms of how you're going to really address it and prevent it to the best of your abilities anyway. So looking at some other data to show how important record keeping is, this data comes from a 2,500 cow grazing organic dairy in the Western United States. And you can see in the different colors of bars that they tracked infectious lesions, which are foot rot and warts, and then non-infectious lesions in the gray color, which were sole ulcers. Apparently that's a tongue twister. Toe ulcers and white line lesions. And so they tracked this throughout over a year, and you can see the different spikes that they had throughout that time. And they were able to identify that they had some late summer heat stress spikes, but then also that probably part of that was just from how far the cows were walking, especially, if being a grazing dairy, the cows are probably walking further later in the season. So this farm was able to identify that they were having more cases at that time, and then hopefully can take some sort of preventative measures to prevent that in future years. So this is an example of some data from a farm that represents about 1,054 cases of lameness on a specific farm. And so that total 1,054 makes up the entire pie chart, all those colors. But when they looked at this data a little bit further, they can see that about 754 of those cows actually represent all of those cases. So what that means is that about 250 cows were visiting the trim chute for lameness 4 or more times per in that 11-month period that they were tracking. So when you have this data, you can look at and identify, okay, this cow is a problem for this specific thing. You know, can I treat her or should I cull her? So having this data is a helpful management tool for you. And you can also use it to look at, you know, repeat offenders, and then also use it to look at who is cured. So this farm had an 85% cure rate of their wart events in their herd. And so they were pretty happy with that 85% cure rate, which is that blue chunk. And it was on an organic dairy, so they did not have the typical antibiotic therapies to utilize. So, you know, you need to determine within your own herd if you think that that 85% cure rate for warts is good or not. And you can track that and adjust as needed. And if you're not happy with your success rate, you know, talk to your veterinarian, talk to whoever to figure out some other ways that you can treat that cause of lameness. And obviously one possible preventative tool is foot baths. Betsy, you look like maybe you wanted to say something. No? Okay. So one more slide, and then I promise I'm turning it over to Betsy. But, you know, you can utilize the data that you have to also track your successes so that you can feel really good about what you're doing, right? So this farm was a conventional freestall farm that had a dirt lot, and they looked at the cure rate of their lesions by the different types. So you can see that for, you know, foot rot, warts, ulcers, bruises, and abscesses, they all had pretty good successful cure rates. So, you know, you can track that on your farm and feel good about what you're doing. It doesn't always necessarily have to be like, oh, I'm tracking this data to figure out what's bad, right? You can track this data to figure out what's going well on your farm. So, moral of the story, tracking your data and tracking your lameness is good. And with that, Betsy, take it away.
All right. That was really good information. And we thank Diamond V for sharing a lot of those slides. They were supposed to present for us this week, but they also had some family issues they had to take care of. So they were very gracious and sent us a bunch of slides, and we had to come up with the rest, which is okay too. So we're going to wing into some prevention and treatment, and we're going to kick this off with our first poll question, I believe, right, Alicia? Well, of this section. So I want to know, do you run a foot bath for your herd? So that is our poll question. And I'm assuming there's going to be some no's in here because there are some beef operations on the line. But our options are yes, copper sulfate, yes, formaldehyde, yes, something else, or no, we use a hoof spray, or no, we don't use anything, which I said might be perfectly fine. So we've got 5 votes in. We can probably end that. And as I figured, 3 people said no, nothing, which is okay. But however, if you are a dairy and you're not using a foot bath, there might be some things we can talk about to help you out if you think you are having a lameness issue. That would be from an infectious problem. So let's get going. All right, so we're going to talk about foot baths. And so to me, foot baths, there's 3 important things we need to keep on top of when we're trying to prevent infectious diseases. And I'm thinking mostly about digital dermatitis or hairy heel warts. So number 1, I love animal behavior. And I think anything we do, we have to keep animal behavior at the forefront, because if the cows don't want to do it, we don't need to fight them. So the design of the foot bath and the placement of the foot bath are both equally important. Next, we're going to talk about the protocol for filling and frequency and cattle hygiene. And those two ideas should be linked. And then we're going to talk about the dose of product needed to be adjusted with a pH of water, which may be very different on every herd. So first off, this is our example design. Dairyland Initiative at the University of Wisconsin has some amazing foot bath resources, like the best. They have so many resources here. And so this is one example of a really good foot bath. And Alicia, you're going to have to click through one by one. So the big thing with foot baths, we want to make sure cows get 2 to 3 dunks per foot. Frequently, I'll see those old black movable portable foot baths, and I hate them because if you've ever walked, like if you walk on them on your bare feet, which you never would, but like they would hurt. They're just not really nice on your foot, and cows do everything they can to avoid them. So I hate them and don't use them. And if I come to your farm, I'm going to ask you why you're using them. So I like this style, whether you put it in permanently or you fashion some way of making it like this. We need to get 2 to 3 dunks per foot. If they can avoid it, of course, they're going to avoid it with the foot that hurts. So we need to make it so it's not avoidable. The depth of it can be 10 inches deep, but we don't need to fill it 10 inches deep. We can fill it 4 to 6 inches. Basically, this allows some sloshing of the water where we don't lose product and we don't, have to spend a lot of money on just filling up a huge volume of water. Next, at the bottom where the feet are, the bottom can be 24 inches wide. We think about a cow, they're basically a barrel on stilts. And so at the bottom, the stilt part, they don't need, it doesn't need to be super wide, but the sloped sides are great because we have to allow the barrel of the cow to pass through. So those sloped sides are really good. Letting the cow pass through, it's narrow, they want to move through it. And the bottom, we're not using a ton of product, but it's adequate to allow the cows to pass through in a single lane. And then one side in this diagram is permanent. It's a concrete sloped wall. And then the other side is actually a piece of sloped plywood with a gate. And that is nice because in the occasion that we do have a cow go down or get stuck or something in that, we can take the plywood out and open the gate and easily get this cow out. Hopefully that doesn't ever happen, but I like to build in safeguards if it does perhaps happen. And then the thing that I also like to do is if we are limited on space, if we have 10 feet only and cows really can wing through that foot bath and maybe we're not getting 2 dunks on every foot, if we put in a taller step-in curb, that 12-inch step-in curb, it physically makes them slow down. So they have to step over it to slow down their speed and make sure we get those 2 dunks per foot. 3 is even better. So that's our design. Next is placement. And this is a photo I took at one of the dairies I work with. And there's a lot of great things about this picture that I really like that are modeled off of the Dairyland one. So number one, when we think about cow behavior, cows don't like to go into dark areas, right? So your foot bath should be in a well-lit spot. If it's not well lit, they're not going to pass through it well because they can't see. They hate shadows. So as well as we can, make it well lit, make it so they can't avoid it. Don't make it so there's a curve that they could step on and avoid the treatment bath. Make sure they can go through it. We want good footing. We don't want it to be slippery. We don't want it to be abrasive. If we have to put down rubber, put down rubber. Rubber is really inexpensive. If cows don't have to hesitate when they're walking in, they're going to go through it much easier. Minimizing any slope, again, that's got to do with the traction thing, and keeping our bath the appropriate fill level. And for the employees or the people actually doing the bath, it's more likely to get done if it's easy to clean. And then also, we probably aren't running a treatment bath every day. So we want to make it easy to bypass when it's not in use. I hate those barns that they build, like in a dry cow barn, or they build the foot bath into the crossover alley. Because guess what? we're only running that bath probably once a week at most. And the rest of the time it's full of manure and it's disgusting. So I hate those. Don't put those in your barn if you're building a barn. So this was an example of one I really liked. He's got great traction. It's fairly well lit. He's got his hose right there. The employee just needs to turn it on to fill the bath. And over on the side, which I didn't take a picture of, he's got his scales so the employee can measure out the product. So we'll go to the next slide. And so when we think about foot baths, first thing I think about is hygiene. So if we have good hygiene, we can control really, our foot bath protocol and, how well we do in terms of control. So when we think about hygiene, and we can think about alleys, laneways, if you're grazing, holding areas, everybody's got to go get milked, stocking density of pens, stocking density of laneways, pen design, alley design, and then really what it comes down to is how clean are those feet. So if all of those things are dirty, we can't expect our feet to be clean. We have to get our feet clean before we go do a treatment. So clean feet is better control, and hopefully with better control of infectious foot problems, we have to do less frequent baths. And I have a bullet point on there of what about soap baths? And soap baths can be very effective in helping to get the manure off of the feet before a treatment bath. And when I say before, I mean like the day before, not immediately before the foot bath. I don't like the 2-foot bath design. I prefer to get our feet clean in the days leading up to our treatment bath and then do our treatment bath the day of. So the first step with foot baths, we have to measure the bath. And so literally like take a tape measure and figure out what is the length, what is the width, and what's the depth. And thankfully, this Dairyland initiative doesn't make you do the math, that you just have to plug in your numbers. So it gives you the gallons in your foot bath. So that's the link. We can make sure it's in the resources thing on box. And so that's the first thing we do, measure our bath. When we do our dosage, you can figure out which product you're using, and then it will tell you how many pounds of product you need to use to get the appropriate concentration. So it's a really great resource if you haven't checked it out. It's easily downloadable and easy to save to your computer. So we have our protocol, we know how frequently we're going to run it, we know which product we're going to use. We have to make sure we have the appropriate pH for the product that we're going to use. So we need to check pH and adjust. Product in general is less effective when the pH goes up, and we need to change our bath when the pH gets above 5. And so people ask, well, how frequently do I need to change it? And that answer is likely different for different herds. Some herds, they need to change the bath after 50 cows. But some herds, for whatever reason, whether they're cleaner or the cows go through it better and don't defecate in the bath, some herds can get up to 300 cows and they have like the perfect water for the situation. But other herds, it's the perfect storm the other way, and we need to change it more frequently because of hard water or poor design or what have you. The other thing I want you to think about is, do we change our foot bath protocol according to need? So when we see, because we're tracking our heel warts, are we changing our protocol when we see more heel warts? And then also in the wintertime, it's tough to run a foot bath. So if we're not running it as much, are we going to run a higher concentration of our product, and making sure that that is marked down when we change it, and we're monitoring how we do afterwards. So basically make sure everyone who's filling the bath knows the protocol and follows it. And we're going to write it down, right? If we don't know when we changed it, how do we know what worked? And so if you don't have a foot bath, sprays and soaking the feet can work if you use them effectively. So prepping the foot first, hygiene, absolutely. So a lot of farms will take not a super high pressure nozzle, but just a garden nozzle, and literally spray it on the cow's feet while they're milking, or after they're done milking before they post-dip, just to get the back of that foot really clean. Because if we have a heel wart and there's manure over top of that heel wart, the treatment can't get to it. So we need to make sure that heel wart is exposed so we can actually get the treatment to it. So we can work with your vet for an appropriate treatment. It might be them writing a script for tetracycline, copper sulfate mixture, whatever it may be. Your vet should be able to give you the appropriate treatment for your issue. I do also want to mention some of the sprays are extremely caustic, like think battery acid. Yeah, it will dry a wart up, but how much are we actually damaging the skin? If you don't want to put it on your hand, don't put it on your cow's foot. And then other people have been, with smaller herds, especially the cows are pretty friendly. We can soak it in a bucket solution. Just make sure the concentration and the pH are correct in that solution. So some considerations for pasture. So the health and integrity of the foot itself is a priority, and healthy tissues are key. So we want to make sure we're doing everything we can for nutrition, keeping the feet healthy, appropriate trace mineral and vitamin levels. But then also we want to make sure we're not introducing something that could harm the health of the foot, whether it be like a 90-degree turn with a very abrasive concrete or really rocky laneways or really sharp stones, anything that cow can hurt the integrity of her foot or the tissue of the foot. All of those things are ways we can introduce infectious bacteria, whether through foot rot or warts. Those warts, they're a result of small tears in the foot from twisting and turning, and it allows the bacteria to access the foot. So we need to keep the foot as healthy as possible. And when we walk far distances, we and different terrain, and cows get pushing, especially early on in the season, they want to get out on grass, making sure that our laneways are as good as they can be, so we minimize any injuries or bruising. Mentioned nutritional changes. Making sure nutrition is up to snuff. We don't want to have soft hooves because that can introduce more bruising and ulcers. And then also, and I think Lindsay might hit on it, if cows are fed outside, making sure that their footing is good, they're not reaching for feed and really pushing against the ground and getting bruising or what have you if we have to feed them outside, if grazing is minimized. And so there's a few ways we can improve walking surfaces. And so number one, we want to reduce mud. Mud will soften the feet and also give a way for bacteria to grow, that if we have hurt tissue, that bacteria is just going to introduce itself into the foot. So reducing mud as much as we can. Some farms have put in concrete or asphalt laneways, which is a huge investment, but on some farms, this is an absolute payback because they're grazing a lot of cows, and the laneways were just causing so much upkeep every year. Introducing rubber into certain spots where there's turns, that's always a good idea. No sharp turns. And then some farms will use less abrasive materials such as sand or sawdust, like we see in this picture here, or shavings. And then thinking about stream crossings and standing water. We don't want to walk cows through standing water if we can avoid it. And stream crossings can be very uneven and hard to navigate. So if we have to cross a stream, maybe we can think about putting in a bridge or something over that cows cross through that instead of through a rocky stream bed. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay at this point. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for joining us today.
Alicia, can you, it's not letting me start my video. No. It says that the host has stopped it. It's not a big deal. I just thought I would turn it on while I talk, but. Oh, there we go. Okay. So yeah, we're going to run through some of the benefits of grazing on lameness. Oh, sorry. And next slide, Alicia. So this, I'm just going to run through a few different studies just to show some different examples and different ways that that pasture has been beneficial, looking at dairy cows and lameness. So this is a study, and they looked at lactating Holsteins, and they were housed in a deep bed sand freestall. So if we think about kind of what we consider the gold standard in terms of cow comfort indoors, they were already housed in that deep bed sand freestall, and then they were either assigned to stay in the barn or to go outside on pasture. They were all lameness scored at the start of the study, and they all kind of averaged about a 3. So there was, a good number of animals that were clinically lame, but right on that border. And you can see over the next 4 weeks, The ones that were on pasture improved, and the ones that stayed in the freestall basically didn't change much at all. So we can say that in this case, going out to pasture had a beneficial effect on lameness, with their gait improving about 0.2 units per week. And you can see by about, week 2 even, they were already down half a point. Interestingly, in this study, lying time also reduced. So when we talk about cows inside, we usually are trying to get them to lie down more because it means then they're not standing on concrete. But in this study, we actually saw reduced lying time when they were outside. And we'll talk a little bit about the time budgets. It's not surprising because we do know that cows on pasture tend to lay down less, partly because they're consuming their dry matter is a little bit more labor intensive. They have to move around to consume it. We're not delivering a really concentrated diet right in front of her. Also, she has a comfortable place to stand. So she may not need to lay down for 12 hours a day if she has that more comfortable place to stand. Next one. So this is another example. This one was 37 dairies in Great Britain, and they looked at 0 grazing dairies so that they were either using freestalls or they had kind of an open straw pack. And they compared them to dairies that grazed in the summer. And they found that the lameness was more than double on those 0 grazing dairies compared to the ones that provided access to pasture during the grazing season. And one more, Alicia. And then in this example, I think this is the last example of the benefits on lameness, just to show that we don't have to give all of our animals access to pasture all the time. So this was a study of 40 freestall dairies in the Northeast US. This is now 10 years old, but they looked at, they did cow comfort assessments on these dairies, mainly focusing on the high producing pens, but that's a pretty good representative of the herd. And they lameness scored them during the assessment, and then they went back and they looked at risk factors for lameness and tried to match up management and facility factors that could be causing lameness. And in this study, some of the herd level associations with lameness prevalence was access to pasture, but specifically in this study, they were asking if it was when the cows were given access to pasture. And more often than not, it was just in the dry period. Very few of the herds were actually giving lactating cows access to pasture. So just providing them with access to pasture for 4 to 6 weeks during that whole lactation had a noticeable significant impact on improving lameness. Next one. So talking about how we can utilize pasture on a dairy or on a farm, and what other things we need to consider with what we're asking from this cow. So this is that time budget graph from Rick Grant. It's looking at a lactating cow housed in a freestall barn. So we see about half of her day is spent lying down. We want her to be eating for about 5 hours a day, milking for about 3 to 3.5 hours a day. And when I'm saying milking, I'm saying from when she leaves the pen, goes to the parlor, and gets back to the pen. Obviously, she's not milking for 3 hours a day, but she's out of the pen for milking. And then she's going to spend a few hours a day just standing, walking around the pen, having social interactions, and about half an hour drinking. So where do we fit in the pasture time in this example? Obviously, she can do some eating, some socializing, and some laying down on pasture, but figuring out when the best time is to try to put that pasture into the schedule. Next one, Alicia. I think the next one might be the poll question. Okay. So for this question, I am asking, do you guys think that cows prefer the pasture over the barn? Yes, no, or it depends? And you guys can see that, right, Alicia? Okay. So yeah, you guys nailed it. It totally depends. It's going to depend on, especially was talking about the quality of that outdoor area. So how do they get there? How far do they have to go? The weather, and the season, time of day, all that stuff. So we're going to talk about that on the next slide. So repeatedly, studies show that cows do really like to be outside, and they like to be outside, especially at night. If we're talking about the summertime, it tends to be cooler at night, obviously. They like to go out at night. They can lay down when it's cooler. During the day, they can be inside, maybe consuming some of that TMR. but they really like to utilize pasture at night. So the study on the left is showing us there's different distances, and I apologize, they're in Canadian. 60 meters, 140 meters, or 260 meters is how far they had to walk from the barn to the pasture. And then they looked at utilization of the outdoor space at different times of day. So if you look at the far right of that graph, you can see that from about 9 o'clock at night to 4 in the morning, so the overnight period, that's when the cows spent most of their time outside. And it really didn't matter how far they had to walk. They still went outside and still utilized the pasture. And then the study on the right was, again, looking at time inside the barn compared to on an outdoor pack. So this is not pasture, they're not grazing, but still just getting off of that, the concrete inside and getting away from free stalls and having freedom to move and lay down where they want. And they looked at summertime versus wintertime. And I want to say this was British Columbia, but I should have double checked, I apologize. So wintertime is not what we consider winter here in the Northeast. It's pretty mild. So it might be a different story if we're looking at a cooler winter also. But they found, especially in the summer, again, so that's time of day on the bottom. So from midnight to 6 a.m., they were outside, inside most of the day. Makes sense. They went to go to milk probably at 6 a.m. They got fed. They just laid down in the barn for a while, milked and fed again, and then they head outside again for the evening. And that's what we see. Betsy's going to talk about a tie stall project we did looking at lameness on tie stalls and looking at a lot of farms that utilize grazing. And for most of them, that's the way they utilized pasture access, is keeping the cows inside during the day and letting them out at night. Some would also then let them out during the day, but it seems like people are recognizing that cows like to be outside at night and letting them out. We also know from another study, and I didn't include it on this slide, but there was another study from British Columbia, again, I believe, that looked at when cows would come inside relative to the temperature. So I mentioned the weather, and they found that actually cows preferred to be indoors once it got above, I think it was about 73 degrees. So that's a testament probably to the fact that we've recognized the impacts of heat stress on cows, and we've started putting in fans and sprinklers and making our barn a lot more of a comfortable environment. So when it's 74 and sunny or 80 and sunny, they don't want to be outside in direct sunlight. They'd rather be in a barn with shade, with a fan blowing on them, with a nice big tub of water in front of them. So again, recognizing when and where we can utilize pasture. Next one. And I just included this because I think it's kind of interesting, and it kind of brings up a point in my final slide about the idea of consumer perceptions about letting cows out on pasture. So obviously, as years go by, we're seeing fewer and fewer cows on pasture. There has been, increases in grass-fed movements and stuff, but in general, we're seeing fewer cows on pasture in the U.S. Even smaller farms, like when Betsy and I tried to get farms enrolled for our tie stall project, a lot of the farms said, we used to use pasture, but we just don't anymore. And it's something that consumers think that cows want. It's something that consumers think is natural. And it's something that a lot of consumers and purchasers think that farmers should be doing, is providing outdoor access or access to pasture. So this is a study from British Columbia, and they looked at whether or not cows wanted to go outside and how much they wanted to go outside. So they used a weighted door. So basically the cows were trained that you walk down this alleyway, you can leave your pen, walk down an alleyway, and there's a gate that goes outside, and then you get access to a pasture. So they're trained, they know that's the routine, and the cows then had to start pushing on the gate to get outside. And once they learned, okay, you push on the gate to go outside, then they started adding weight to the gate. Now you have to push a little harder to go outside, and so on and so on. And we know from previous studies how much cows are willing to push on a feed bunk. So if you have a post and rail, and you ever see those pictures looking down the feed bunk, and you can see how the post and the rail has now bent because the cows will feed so aggressively, and they'll actually push so hard on that rail that they can actually cause tissue damage. That's how hard she wants her TMR. In this study, they actually found that cows would work pretty much as hard as that to gain access to pasture. So in these two graphs, on the left here, you're looking at TMR is the black line and pasture is the light teal kind of, and it's showing you the proportion of cows that would keep pushing as the weight got higher and higher. And it follows a pretty similar trend for TMR and pasture, that a lot of the cows are pushing, even at these higher weights, like up to 100 pounds, cows were still pushing to get out, to go outside. And then they broke it down by time of day. So again, the black line is the TMR, that didn't change, but now we have the yellow line of AM and the red line of PM. And we can see that cows worked a little bit harder to gain access to go outside at night. Again, just solidifying, they do want to go outside when the time is right. And usually it's at night when it's nice and cool and they just kind of want to chill out, basically. Next slide, thank you. So I believe this is my last slide. So the pros of pasture for lameness, obviously we see lower lameness prevalence pretty consistently, but again, it comes down to management. Just like how we say we usually see lower lameness on a farm that uses deep beds compared to mattresses, there's always, a low asterisk. You have to manage the pasture, like Betsy was talking about. We don't want to see lots of mud and rocks and things like that that are going to make it less desirable. Another pro is that cows do seem to like it. And there's that image idea, that consumer perception that we might have to think about more, especially as we move forward. Some of the negatives, like I mentioned, it needs proper management. It's not easy. And that's one of the main things when we were talking to farmers and trying to get them enrolled in our study, and they said they stopped doing it. It was hard to do, they said. And they had, it's harder to find good labor. They're having to pay labor more. It was just one more thing they had to worry about. And so they just stopped doing it. And also regulations. Especially here in New York State, we have a lot of regulations, CAFO farms. It's not exactly like you can just open your barn door and let your cows go if you've got green grass. It's not how it works. So, and that's obviously also part of the puzzle that's not going away. And if anything, we're going to see more and more environmental regulations. So managing all of that and then trying to figure out if we can still provide these cows with some access to outdoors.
All right, this is the last section here. And Lindsay, I'm going to invite you to stay close. All right, so this was a project that Lindsay and I did spanning a couple of years. The start was in 2017, which I can't believe was 4 years ago. It blew me when I would have looked it up. And so we, as she's mentioned, we worked with Thai stall dairy specifically. And so we measured barn data, stall design, measurements, ventilation, what have you. And then we looked at lameness, both in-stall scoring, like what Lindsay talked about, and then locomotion scoring if they let them outdoors. And then we also looked at lying time using the data loggers that go on their legs. And then other cow data, hock scores, knee scores, neck scores, et cetera. And so this particular farm sticks with me because their barn was awesome. It had the perfect stall design. They had really high neck rails, really long stalls, really cushy mats. Like they had just invested in really good mats like a year or two before. Like the barn was perfect, really long tie chains, like everything we want to see in a Thai stall barn if we're going to use a Thai stall barn. But you'll see as we go forward, there were some issues with this farm. So the dairy had to walk a really long distance to their pasture. It was greater than a mile away to the farthest paddock, and they were grazing both ends of the day. They did have really rocky laneways. They had several stream crossings, and they were pushing dry matter intake from pasture. They were over 60 up to 90% grass in their diets. They did not have a foot bath. They were trying to use a spray. They trimmed as needed. It wasn't on a set schedule. The owner would pick up a foot if it looked sore. And she was treating greater than 4 a month for lameness herself. So she knew they had a lameness issue and they didn't know what to do. Like I said, excellent stall design and comfort in the barn, tunnel ventilated, it had really good wind. But the cows aren't really in the barn much in the summertime, especially because they're grazing so much. And then when we do our intake form, we always ask, why are you culling cows? And their top reasons were repro and feet and legs. So that was important for us to get from the owner. So when we looked, this chart is showing line time. And so we have the 10 farms in this round of the study on this graph. And we looked at the average hours of line time for each herd. So they're farm 10 right in the middle, and they had on average 11 hours of line time, 11.1, which, for a grazing dairy, okay, they're right in the middle of everybody and, not too bad. Anything you want to add about that, Lindsay?
Yeah, I think the two that had the lowest 7.7 and 8.6 hours, those were also, one was organic and then one was just strictly grazing too. So yeah, they were a lot lower than an average.
Yeah. And, for this farm to have right in the middle of the pack with lying time and grazing so much, we're like, okay, this looks all right from this perspective. But let's look at the next one. So we also look at the diurnal lying pattern. And so the benchmark, all of those 10 herds is in that red dashed line. And you can see, so we have time of day from midnight to 11 p.m. as you read across the bottom. And then the hours within that, the minutes within the hour that they're laying down. So from between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning, all the way on the left, they're laying down about 45 minutes out of the 60 minutes. And so our farm 10 is in that gray. And you can see, like Lindsay talked about, these cows wanted to lie down overnight. And so, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, pretty much everybody's laying down the full hour. We have milking at 5 a.m. and 6 p.m. So there's our milking time. So you see, very little lying time during those hours. And this farm, they're walking a long distance. So there's times of the day where nobody's laying down because they're hoofing it to or from the milking facility. So, our pattern follows similarly to what our benchmark was. But you see some of these peaks like overnight. Yep. They were really a lot of cows laying down. And then, about noontime, I think they're all tuckered out from grazing and most of them were laying down noon, 1 o'clock. They found a shady spot. So really interesting data for this farm, follows our benchmark, but a few differences. So let's look at our next thing. We also looked at bout frequency and length. So this is the time with the bout frequency, is how many times they lay down during the day. So in one 24-hour period, our farm 10 cows laid down 9 times. And that was a little bit less than average. You see our range from, farm 6 laid down 6.6 times a day on average, and farm 9, those cows were up and down pretty much every hour. No, that's not right. 13 times, they up and down. Yeah. Every other hour they were up and down. There we go. Get my frequency right. So that's our bout frequency. And then the chart on the right, our bout length. When this set of cows lay down, they lay down for over an hour at a time. So they lay down 81 minutes at a time, but they only lay down 9 hours. So interesting with this herd, we think about if we were to watch these cows went out to pasture, they grazed, and then they laid down. They lay down for over an hour at a time. That was what they did. They ate, they lay down. And so we said, okay, this is what our lying time says. How do we relate this to what we're seeing with cow comfort factors or lameness? And so the next chart actually shows our lameness. So we have good barn design, good comfort in the barn, but yet we have a lot of these troubles going out to pasture and seeing what our cows do when they're out in pasture. And so in this, our benchmark again is in the gray, our benchmark is in the red and our farm is in the gray. And we looked on a 3-point scale. So sound cows, so cows that aren't lame, our benchmark's at 76%. This farm only had 55% of cows sound. Moderately lame, our benchmark was 20% of cows moderately lame. This farm had 30. And then severely lame, which, those are the 8 cows that this farm said today, yep, I have 8 cows lame. That was that 15% when our benchmark only says 4% are severely lame. So this farm knew they had a problem. I think they also underestimated, this moderately lame percent. Because she was treating cows, she knew they're lame cows, but we're missing these moderately lame cows. What else do I want to say about this, Lindsay? Anything?
No, I think so. And I think that's not unusual. Like when Alicia talked about farms, underestimating how many lame cows they have. It's usually those moderately lame ones. Most farms are pretty spot on in knowing how many severely lame cows they have. It's those moderately lame ones that are harder to detect.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this project, we'd work with farms to try and make changes so that their lameness improved, right? And so they knew that warts were a big part of their issue. And so we wanted to get control of the warts. And I don't know. I don't know exactly where the mud was coming from, but these cows were actually pretty dirty. So we worked to improve laneways, improve stream crossings, and basically get the hygiene better. They didn't know where they could put in a foot bath, so they wanted to try and get cows cleaner to begin with. So that was one thing. The stream crossings, they wanted to improve laneways and stream crossings and stop getting the injuries and the bruising that they were seeing when they, getting the rocks in their feet. She wanted to start doing more frequent trims instead of just treating lame cows. So she was going to employ a real hoof trimmer to come more frequently to monitor hoof health. And then improving nutrition. So instead of making sure cows are eating every last bit of grass out there, she was going to start feeding more feed in the barn when necessary, and really monitoring dry matter intake from grazing. So interestingly, this farm ended up buying a freestall barn. They still grazed, they still extensively grazed. However, the farm down the road came for sale and they moved to a freestall, which is fine. They didn't care either way, freestall or tie stall, but the laneways were much better. The grazing was much closer. It's a far better situation. And so some of the things, alleviated themselves because the laneways were better because it's just different laneways. But some of it too, she wanted to make sure her stalls were still very comfortable and cows weren't getting injured in the barn when they were there. So lots of things we can do. Even if we don't have a foot bath, we have to think, where are they getting injured and how can we alleviate it? And monitoring too. Their warts were different in the summer than they were in the winter. So knowing what are we treating and when, and making changes. So that's what I had. Do you want to any wrap up stuff you guys wanted to say? All right. I will do key considerations then. All right, so as we've discussed, I hope we've pounded it into your brain. Lameness is absolutely a scale from sound to mildly lame to severely lame. When we think that yes, no, we're probably just thinking the severely lame cows. So if we can pick up on small changes earlier, in her gait earlier, that should alert you to a lameness event sooner, even if you don't see a lesion when she goes across the table. Make sure you know how to monitor and track all lameness on the farm. And the things I went over, ensuring your foot bath is designed correctly and located properly. Those are essential. Double checking foot bath dosage, concentration, and making sure hygiene is key for prevention of some infectious lameness. And Lindsay's point, consider utilizing pasture or outdoor space when possible because it will help. So with that, we invite you to submit any questions to the Q&A. If you want to raise a hand, if you want to ask a live question, we can certainly unmute you so you can ask live and we can have discussion. And next week is our Maximizing Your Pasture Investment session with Mary Kate McKenzie, and we're looking forward to that. And then after that, the only one we have is our panel discussion for our final week. So what am I forgetting, Alicia?
We will put the recording as well as all the resources in today's presentation in the box folder. So you can access that there. Lindsay, I apologize. I just realized we didn't include your contact information in the PowerPoint. If you want to include it, we're happy to add that and upload that version.
Yeah, I can put it in the chat box too.
Perfect. And then per the usual each week at the end of this, your survey will pop up. We would love your feedback on this session and can use that to continue to inform the last two sessions of the series as well as future programming.
You guys are so quiet this week.
We did throw a little bit of a lot of information at them.
A little bit of a lot of information, yes. Feel free to always reach out to any one of us with questions. We're happy to come out and assess. If you're in our region, I know there's a couple of people that are outside of region, but we can direct you to your extension person if you're outside of a region. So. Can't believe we didn't even get a single question.
People tuned us out.
So thank you again, Lindsay, so much for helping us
Yeah.
out.
Thanks for
Yeah.
having me.
Yeah. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. We will see you next week.